A police officer saw an elderly man struggling in the park and stopped to help. When mysterious men in suits showed up at his door the next day, he discovered a dark truth that made his blood run cold. The autumn wind rustled through the trees of Central Park in Platteville as Officer James Miller walked his usual beat. His polished black shoes crunched against fallen leaves, the sound mixing with the distant chatter of park visitors. The weight of his badge pressed against his chest, a reminder of his 15 years of service that felt heavier lately. "Morning, Officer Miller." A jogger waved as she passed. James nodded, managing a small smile. "Stay safe, Mrs. Chun." He checked his watch, 2:15 p.m. The park was quieter than usual for a Thursday afternoon. His radio crackled. "All units, be advised. Keep civilian interactions brief and professional. Command out." James sighed, adjusting his utility belt. These new department policies kept coming, each one pushing officers further from the community they served. He remembered a time when knowing your beat meant knowing your neighbors. The path curved around the old fountain, where a group of kids played with paper boats. Their laughter echoed across the water, but James noticed something else. An elderly man with a walker struggling on the uneven pavement near the east entrance. The man's walker caught on a crack, making him stumble. James quickened his pace, covering the distance in long strides. "Sir, let me help you with that." James reached out, steadying both the walker and the man. "Much obliged, officer." The man's voice was warm but strained. His hands trembled slightly on the walker's grips. "These paths aren't what they used to be." James recognized him now, Walter Thompson, who taught at Platteville High for over 3 decades. "Mr. Thompson? I'm Officer Miller." James Miller. Walter's face brightened with recognition. "Little Jimmy Miller? Good Lord, you were in my American history class, weren't you?" "Class of 98. 99, sir." James smiled, keeping a steady hand on the walker. "You gave me my first B-, and you earned every bit of that minus, young man." Walter chuckled, then winced as he shifted his weight. James noticed a man in an expensive suit watching them from near the chess tables, phone in hand. Something about his stance made James uneasy. "How about I walk with you a bit, Mr. Thompson? These paths can be tricky." Walter nodded gratefully. "That would be kind. I haven't been out as much lately. The legs aren't what they used to be." They started walking slowly, James matching Walter's careful pace. The suited man moved too, paralleling their path from a distance. "How long have you been having trouble with the walker, sir?" "Oh, a few months now." Walter's breathing was slightly labored. "Since Martha passed, it's been harder to keep up with everything. The house especially." James remembered the Thompson house, a beautiful Victorian on Maple Street. "That's right. You're still in the old place?" A shadow crossed Walter's face. "For now. Things are changing in the neighborhood." James's radio crackled again. "Officer Miller." "Excuse me a moment, Mr. Thompson." James stepped away slightly. "Miller here." His supervisor's voice was clipped. "We've discussed personal involvement with civilians, Miller. Keep it professional. Just assisting a citizen, sir. Standard community policing. That's not how others see it. Wrap it up." James clicked off, noticing the suited man was now on his phone, speaking in low tones. "Everything all right, officer?" Walter asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yes, sir. Just checking in." James glanced at the suited man again. "Mr. Thompson, have you had any unusual visitors lately? Anyone asking about your house?" Walter's grip tightened on his walker. "Why do you ask?" "Just looking out for our senior residents. There have been reports." "Actually," Walter lowered his voice, "there have been some people, very persistent people. They leave cards, make calls, keep talking about property values and community development." He shook his head. "But I wasn't born yesterday. I know pressure when I see it." A black SUV pulled up to the curb near the suited man. The tinted windows reflected the afternoon sun. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to give you my card." James pulled out his notepad, writing quickly. "My direct line's on the back. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, or if you need anything at all." "Thank you, James." Walter took the card, his hand steadier now. "You know, in 30 years of teaching, I always said character shows itself in small moments. How we treat others when no one's watching." He glanced at the SUV. "Or when they are." James's radio buzzed again. Miller, return to station. I should get you home, Mr. Thompson. No, no. Walter waved him off. I may be slow, but I can manage. Been walking these paths for 50 years. He smiled. Besides, sounds like you're needed elsewhere. James watched Walter make his way toward Maple Street, his walker leaving small marks in the scattered leaves. The SUV pulled away from the curb, following the same direction. Back at his patrol car, James pulled out his notebook and wrote, Thompson Walter, 78, Maple Street, Victorian. Possible developer pressure. He underlined pressure twice, then added, black SUV. Check plates? His radio crackled one final time. Miller, station. Now. James started the car, but kept watching the path where Walter had gone. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut, the same way he'd learned to feel trouble coming in 15 years on the force. The autumn wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across his windshield. James put the car in drive, but his mind stayed on Maple Street, on an old Victorian house, and on the dark SUV that seemed to take too much interest in both. James sat in his patrol car outside the station, still holding his notebook. His supervisor's words could wait. First, he needed to understand what was happening on Maple Street. He pulled up the local property records on his laptop, scanning recent sales. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Good to see community policing alive in Platteville. Let's talk soon. The afternoon sun was already dipping when James made another pass through Central Park. Relief washed over him when he spotted Walter still there, resting on a bench near the Rose Garden. Mind if I join you, Mr. Thompson? James asked, approaching carefully to not startle him. Walter looked up, his face brightening. Twice in one day? I'm beginning to feel like a person of interest, Officer Miller. James sat down, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. Just checking in. You mentioned some changes in the neighborhood. Ah, Walter straightened slightly. You noticed that, did you? Always were observant even in class. Except when Melissa Chan was sitting in front of you. James felt his ears redden. You noticed that too? I noticed everything. Still do. Walter gestured toward the Parks tree line. See that oak there? Used to be a gathering spot for my students during lunch. Now it's got a future development site sign hidden behind it. How long has this been going on? Walter's fingers drummed against his walker. Started about 6 months ago, right after Martha. He paused, swallowing hard. After my wife passed. First, it was just letters, offering to buy the house, talking about how I might want to downsize. Then came the phone calls, the visits, the men in suits, among others. Walter pulled an envelope from his jacket. Got this yesterday. Notice of code violations. Funny thing is, no inspector ever came to the house. James examined the letter. The letterhead read, Platinum Development Corporation. They're systematically targeting the older homes, Walter continued, his voice taking on the familiar teaching tone James remembered. First, they approach with offers. When that doesn't work, they find other ways. Pressure, citations, concerned citizen, complaints. A jogger passed by, slowing slightly to look at them. James noticed the same high-end running shoes he'd seen on the suited man earlier. Your house, James said carefully. It's been in your family long? Martha's family. 4 generations. Walter's voice softened. Our daughter Sarah was born in that front room. Martha planted every rose in that garden. Now they're telling me the porch is structurally unsound and the wiring needs to be completely replaced. He shook his head. I may be old, James, but I'm not foolish. James's radio remained silent, but he felt his phone buzz again. Same unknown number. Community relations are important. Let's discuss opportunities. Mr. Thompson, would you mind showing me these violations they're claiming? Walter's eyes crinkled. Thought you'd never ask. But won't you get in trouble? That radio of yours has been mighty demanding today. Some things are worth a little trouble. James stood, offering his arm for support. Besides, I'm just responding to a citizen complaint about potential fraud. They walked slowly down Maple Street, Walter pointing out houses along the way. The Hendersons lived there, moved out last month. The Williams place, empty now. Even old Mrs. Chen's bakery is gone. The Victorian came into view, its weathered elegance a stark contrast to the modern developments creeping in around it. The late afternoon sun caught the stained glass above the door, sending colored shadows across the wraparound porch. "Martha chose those colors," Walter said quietly. "Said they'd catch the sunset just right." James noticed fresh tire marks in the gravel near the house. "You've had visitors today? They come and go. Take pictures. Make notes." Walter's grip tightened on his walker. "Sometimes just sit in their cars and watch." They climbed the porch steps slowly, each board solid under their feet. "Structurally unsound?" James tested the railing. "I'm not seeing it. Come inside. I'll show you what they're really after." The interior was like stepping into a living history book. Original hardwood floors gleamed beneath carefully preserved Persian rugs. Built-in bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and family photos. Walter led him to a large bay window overlooking the back garden. "See that new development through the trees? They're calling it Platinum Estates. 800,000 per unit." He turned to James. "My property connects their Phase 1 to Phase 2. I'm what they call an obstacle." James's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. "They offered money at first," Walter continued, settling into an armchair that Martha had clearly picked out. "Quite a bit, actually. But this house." He gestured to the walls, the photos, the memories. "You can't put a price on some things. May I take pictures? Document the supposed violations?" "Of course." Walter handed him another stack of letters. "I've kept everything. Martha was always the organized one, but I've learned." As James photographed the house, Walter told stories. About teaching 3 generations of Platteville students. About Martha's garden parties. About the night their daughter Sarah was born during a thunderstorm. A car door slammed outside. Through the stained glass, James saw a familiar black SUV pulling away. "They'll be back," Walter said matter-of-factly. "They always come back." James finished his documentation, every picture contradicting the violation notices. "Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to make an official statement about these incidents? Will it help?" "It might, especially if others come forward too." Walter stood slowly, using his walker for support. "You know, James, I taught civics for 30 years. Told my students that the system works if good people work within it." He looked out at his garden, where Martha's roses still bloomed. "I'd like to believe that's still true." As they reached the porch, James noticed a new envelope tucked into the doorframe. The Platinum Development logo gleamed in the fading light. "Leave it," Walter said. "Add it to the collection tomorrow." James's phone buzzed one final time. "Officer Miller, your community relations skills have been noted. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Platinum Developments welcomes your input." The sunset caught Martha's stained glass just right, sending ribbons of color across the porch. Walter stood in their light, looking more determined than tired. "You should go," he said, "before your radio starts again." "But James—" He held out his hand. "Thank you for listening." "Really listening?" James shook the offered hand, feeling the strength still present in Walter's grip. "I'll check back tomorrow, Mr. Thompson." "I know you will." Walter smiled. "You always did finish your homework." Eventually, walking back to his car, James heard Walter's door lock, 3 deadbolts carefully engaged. His phone felt heavy in his pocket, the developer's messages waiting for response. Tomorrow would bring decisions. But tonight, James had documentation to review and a nagging suspicion that Platteville's development boom had roots that needed exposing. The fluorescent lights of the Platteville police station buzzed overhead as James spread out the documentation on his desk. Property records, violation notices, and his photos from Walter's house covered every inch of space. His morning coffee sat untouched, already cold. "Miller." Sergeant Peterson's voice cut through the quiet. "My office." James gathered the papers quickly, sliding them into a folder. The walk to Peterson's office felt longer than usual. "Close the door." Peterson didn't look up from his computer. "Want to explain why you're running background checks on Platinum Development Corporation?" "Following up on potential fraud, sir. Multiple complaints about Dash." "Stop." Peterson finally looked at him. "You're a patrol officer, Miller. Not a detective. Not a private investigator. And certainly not whatever you think you're being right now." James remained standing. "Sir, there's clear evidence of Dash. Evidence? Peterson laughed. Of what? A legitimate business making legitimate offers? Development is progress, Miller. Progress means change. Change means some people get uncomfortable. They're targeting elderly residents, sir. Using fraudulent violation notices to dash, Peterson held up his hand. You met with Walter Thompson yesterday. Twice. After being told to limit civilian contact, he needed assistance. He needed a social worker or a real estate agent. Peterson leaned forward. This isn't just about Thompson, is it? How many properties have you been looking into? James hesitated. The folder felt heavy in his hands. Show me, Peterson demanded. James opened the folder, laying out the pattern. 12 properties in the last 6 months. All elderly owners. All received violation notices after refusing initial offers. All notices came from city departments, but there's no record of actual inspections. And you access these records how? Public information, sir? Peterson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at James. Go home, Miller. Take the rest of the day. Think about your career. Sir Dash, that's an order. Peterson stood. And Miller? Stay away from Maple Street. James walked out, the folder tucked under his arm. In the parking lot, his phone rang. An unknown number. Officer Miller. The voice was smooth, professional. Bob Carson, Platinum Development. We missed you this morning. James got into his car. I was on duty. Of course. Look, we value community input, especially from law enforcement. Perhaps we could reschedule? Discuss how to make this transition easier for everyone. Through his windshield, James saw the same black SUV from yesterday parked across the street. What kind of transition? Progress, Officer Miller. The kind that benefits everyone. Your insight into the community would be compensated appropriately. James started his engine. Send any proposals through official channels. Like your friend Mr. Thompson did? Strange how many code violations one old house can have. James gripped the steering wheel tighter. Is that a threat, Mr. Carson? A observation. Think about our offer. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. James pulled out of the parking lot, checking his rearview mirror. The SUV stayed put. His phone buzzed again. A text from Walter. More visitors today. Asking about you. James changed direction, heading toward Maple Street. Peterson's order echoed in his head, but some things mattered more than orders. He parked a block away, walking the rest of the distance. 2 men in suits stood on Walter's porch, knocking repeatedly. Can I help you, gentlemen? James called out, approaching the steps. They turned. The taller one smiled without warmth. Officer Miller. Unexpected pleasure. Mr. Carson, I presume? In the flesh. Carson gestured to the door. Just trying to have a friendly chat with Mr. Thompson, who seems uninterested in chatting. The second man stepped forward. We have concerns about this property's compliance with city codes. Really? James pulled out his phone, showing yesterday's photos. Funny, I just documented every alleged violation. Found nothing matching your notices. Carson's smile tightened. You're interfering with a private business matter, officer. I'm investigating potential fraud. Want to talk about those inspection reports that don't exist? The door opened slightly. Walter's voice came through the gap. Everything all right out here? Fine, Mr. Thompson. James called back. These gentlemen were just leaving. Carson straightened his tie. Think about what side you want to be on, Miller. Progress doesn't stop for sentimentality. They walked to their SUV, Carson pausing at the vehicle. Oh, an officer? Sergeant Peterson sends his regards. James watched them drive away, then turned to Walter. You okay? Walter opened the door fully. Better now, though I wish you hadn't come. Might make trouble for you. Trouble found me already. James followed Walter inside. They've been watching your house? Since dawn. Walter settled into his armchair. But they're not just watching me anymore. What do you mean? Walter handed him a stack of photos. James recognized himself. At the park, at Walter's house, at the station. Found these in my mailbox this morning, Walter said quietly. Along with a new offer. They're calling it a community compromise package. James flipped through the photos. They're trying to pressure you, through me, and you through me. Walter sighed. I'm not worth your career, James. This isn't about worth, Mr. Thompson. It's about right and wrong. James pocketed the photos. Have you contacted a lawyer? Can't afford one. Not after Martha's medical bills. James's phone buzzed. Peterson calling. He ignored it. I might know someone, James said. Legal aid clinic downtown. They handle elder advocacy cases. Walter looked out at his garden. Martha always said you can't fight City Hall. Maybe not, but we can make them follow their own rules. James pulled out his notebook. I need you to tell me everything. Every visit, every call, every letter. Times, dates, names if you have them. They spent the next hour documenting everything. James's phone kept buzzing. Peterson, Carson, unknown numbers. Finally, Walter set down his pen. What happens now? Now? James stood. Now we find out how deep this goes. And who else they've been pressuring. Be careful, James. These people, they play for keeps. So do I, Mr. Thompson? James headed for the door. Keep it locked. I'll check back tomorrow. In his car, James finally checked his messages. One from Peterson. Final warning. One from Carson. Reconsider our offer. And one from an unknown number. Maple Street Properties non-negotiable. Don't make this difficult. James started his engine, his decision already made. Some lines were meant to be crossed. Some stands were meant to be taken. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight, he had work to do. James woke to the sound of tires on gravel. The digital clock by his bed read 7:15 a.m. Through his bedroom window, he saw the black SUV pulling up to his curb. His phone had 3 missed calls from Peterson and a text from Walter. They're back. Early this time, James got dressed quickly, strapping on his off-duty weapon. The doorbell rang just as he finished his coffee. 2 men stood on his porch. Carson's smile looked practiced in the morning light. Officer Miller. Hope we're not too early. What do you want, Carson? Just a chat. Carson gestured to his companion. This is Michael Wells, our community relations director. Wells held out a leather portfolio. May we come in? James blocked the doorway. Say what you came to say. Professional courtesy, Carson said smoothly. Colleague to colleague. These conversations deserve privacy. James stepped aside, letting them enter. He didn't offer them seats. Nice place, Wells commented, looking around. Smaller than I expected for someone of your position. Civil servant's salary. James crossed his arms. Get to the point. Carson opened Wells's portfolio. Platteville is growing, Officer Miller. Change is inevitable. Smart people position themselves accordingly, and stupid ones get run over. James kept his voice neutral. Crude, but accurate. Carson pulled out a document. We value local insight. Community connections. Someone like you could be very helpful in smoothing transitions. What kind of transitions? Wells smiled. Property acquisitions. Community outreach. Helping older residents understand their options. Like Walter Thompson? Among others. Carson slid the document across James's coffee table. We're prepared to offer a generous consulting fee. $20,000 per successful transition. James picked up the paper. Define successful. Property secured at market rate. No complications. Carson leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, for instance. Beautiful house, but clearly too much for him now. You could help him see that by threatening him with fake violations. Wells's smile vanished. By helping him understand reality. Progress requires change. Change requires cooperation. James's phone buzzed. Another text from Walter. 3 more suits here. Different ones. And if I decline? Carson stood. Officer Miller. James, you're a practical man. Look at your career prospects. Look at your mortgage payments. He gestured around the small living room. Is this really worth sacrificing for one stubborn old man? Get out. Think about Dash now. James's hand rested near his weapon. Before I start thinking about harassment charges, Wells gathered his portfolio. You're making a mistake. Add it to my file. At the door, Carson turned back. Sergeant Peterson mentioned your father. 20 years on the force, wasn't it? Shame about his pension review coming up. James stepped closer. That a threat? An observation? Carson smiled again. Have a good day, Officer Miller. We'll be in touch. James watched through the window as they drove away. His phone buzzed immediately. Peterson. Miller. My office. 1 hour. Peterson's voice was tight. And Miller? Bring your badge. James hung up, then dialed Walter's number. No answer. He grabbed his keys, heading for the car. His police radio crackled from the kitchen. He'd brought it home last night. All units be advised. Disturbance reported at 1242 Maple Street. Walter's address. James broke every speed limit getting there. 2 police cruisers already sat outside the Victorian house, lights flashing. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Officer Chun, Sarah Chin's mother, met him at the police tape. "James, you can't be here. What happened?" "Anonymous call. Reported trespassing. Possible break-in." She lowered her voice. "James, Peterson's on his way. You need to go." Through the crowd, James spotted Walter sitting on his porch steps, looking shaken. 3 men in suits stood nearby, talking to another officer. "Those men," James pointed. "They work for Platinum Development." "James, please." Chun grabbed his arm. "Don't make this worse." His phone buzzed. "Carson, unfortunate situation. Still time to reconsider our offer." James ducked under the tape. Chin called after him, but he kept walking. Walter looked up as he approached. "James, they said someone broke in, but nothing's missing. Nothing's disturbed." "Mr. Thompson," the officer taking notes, stepped forward. "We need to finish your statement." James recognized him. Rookie named Martinez, fresh from academy. "What exactly was reported?" "That's not your concern, Officer Miller." Peterson's voice cut through the scene. He'd arrived silently, parking down the block. "You're not on duty." "Sir, these men dash. Are witnesses reporting suspicious activity?" Peterson turned to Martinez. "Escort Officer Miller from the scene." "Sir dash now Martinez." James felt Chin's hand on his shoulder. "Come on. Not here. Not like this." He let her lead him back to the tape. The men in suits watched, speaking quietly into phones. "Sarah's worried about you," Chin said softly. "We all are. Whatever this is, it's bigger than one house. That's why it matters." James watched Walter, still sitting alone on his steps. "They're not just taking homes, Jenny. They're erasing history." His phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. Final offer expires at noon. Choose wisely." Peterson was taking Walter's statement now. The old teacher's shoulders were slumped, his walker leaning and used against the porch rail. James checked his watch. 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes until his meeting with Peterson. "Tell Sarah I'm sorry," he said to Chun. "But some things you can't walk away from." James dashed, but he was already walking to his car. He had a badge in his locker and a decision to make. Behind him, Walter's roses swayed in the morning breeze, their petals falling like memories onto the grass. James sat in his truck outside the station, staring at his badge. Peterson's ultimatum still rang in his ears. Badge and gun, or drop the Thompson case. His phone lit up with Walter's number. "James? They're here again. Different ones this time. They're taking pictures of everything. I'm on my way." James turned the key, badge still in his lap. "No, wait." Walter's voice dropped. "You need to see something first. Remember those documents I mentioned? The ones I've been keeping? The harassment evidence? More than that. Much more." Papers rustled in the background. "Can you come by after dark?" "Use the back door." James glanced at his watch. 6:45 p.m. "Give me an hour." "And James? Don't let them follow you." The line went dead. James pulled away from the station, checking his mirrors. No black SUVs, but a silver sedan pulled out 2 cars behind him. He took 4 right turns. The sedan stayed with him. "Amateurs," he muttered, then cut through a grocery store parking lot, emerged on a side street, and doubled back toward Maple Street. The Victorian was dark when he arrived, but he spotted movement behind the curtains. He parked 2 blocks away, walked through 3 backyards, and approached Walter's house from behind. 3 quick knocks on the back door. Walter's voice came through. "Password?" "You never gave me one, Mr. Thompson." A chuckle. "Good answer." The door opened. Quick inside. Walter's kitchen was lit only by a small lamp on the counter. Papers covered the table, documents, photos, letters. "Been doing some organizing," Walter said, settling into a chair. "Martha would be proud." And horrified, James picked up a photo. It showed Carson shaking hands with Peterson outside City Hall. "When was this?" 3 months ago, right after the first violation notices started. Walter pushed more papers forward. Look at the dates. Look at the names. James spread them out. Property transfers, violation notices, bank records. Where did you get all this? I wasn't always just a teacher. Walter tapped his walker. Taught civics, remember? Kept in touch with some former students. One works at the county records office. Another at the bank. Mr. Thompson, this is evidence. Walter's voice hardened. Of conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. They didn't count on an old man having friends. Or time to dig. A car door slammed outside. They both froze. Back porch, Walter whispered. 8 seconds. What? Time it takes their surveillance to circle the house. I've counted. He pointed to more papers. These are copies. Originals are safe. Sarah has them. Your daughter? Walter nodded. She's a lawyer in Chicago. Everything's documented, notarized, ready for the FBI. Footsteps crunched on gravel. James moved to the window, staying in shadows. 2 men in suits walked past, phones out. They're getting bolder, Walter said quietly. Used to just watch. Now, they want us to know they're watching. James photographed documents rapidly with his phone. This connects Peterson directly to Platinum, and Platinum to 6 other cities. Same pattern. Target elderly homeowners, manufacture code violations, pressure sales. Walter's hands shook slightly. Martha saw it starting. Made me promise to fight. Another car pulled up outside. James recognized Peterson's voice. Time to go, Walter said. Use the cellar door. Comes out behind the garage. What about you? I'll be fine. Been dealing with bullies since before you were born. Walter smiled. Go. Do what needs doing. James hesitated. They'll know I was here. They already know. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Footsteps on the porch. A sharp knock. Mr. Thompson? Peterson's voice. Need to discuss another complaint? Walter stood slowly. 8 seconds, Officer Miller. Make them count. James slipped through the cellar door as Walter's shuffling steps moved toward the front of the house. The space under the garage was tight, smelling of earth and old motor oil. He heard the front door open. Walter's voice carried, Sergeant Peterson. Rather late for a social call. Cut the act, Thompson. Where is he? Who? Miller. His car's been spotted nearby. Haven't seen him, but my memory's not what it used to be. Would you like to check my violation notices again? James crawled through the narrow space, emerging behind a hedge. Through gaps in the leaves, he saw more vehicles arriving. Carson stepped out of the black SUV. His phone vibrated. Text from Chun, they're moving on Thompson. Tonight. Be careful. Another text followed. Sarah's got the files. Do what you have to do. James moved through shadows toward his truck, Walter's documents burning a hole in his phone. Each photo was a bullet, aimed straight at Peterson's career, at Carson's empire, at a system that saw dollar signs instead of people. From 2 blocks away, he heard Peterson's voice rise. Last chance, Thompson. Sign or face the consequences. Walter's reply was too quiet to hear, but James could imagine the old teacher's stance. The same quiet dignity he'd shown generations of students. His phone lit up. Sarah Thompson, got your message. Files received. FBI contact standing by. Sure about this? James started his truck. Behind him, lights blazed from Walter's house. Time to choose sides. I'm sure, he texted back. Tell them everything. He pulled away just as more vehicles turned onto Maple Street. In his rearview mirror, Walter's Victorian stood proud against the night sky, its stained glass windows glowing like Martha's roses in the dark. Sometimes you had to break good rules to fight bad ones. Sometimes the badge meant more off than on. And sometimes an old teacher and a cop could change more than just a neighborhood. They could change the whole damn game. The downtown legal aid office smelled of old coffee and printer ink. Sarah Thompson looked exactly like her father. Same determined eyes, same straight spine. You're taking a huge risk, she said, spreading the evidence across her borrowed desk. They'll end your career. James sipped cold coffee from a paper cup. Already did. Turned in my badge this morning. Dad told me. She held up her phone, showing dozens of photos. He's been documenting everything. Every visit. Every threat. Smart man. Smarter than they counted on. Sarah pulled out a thick file. Look at this pattern. Platinum Development's done this in 3 other states. Always the same. Target elderly homeowners, isolated properties, historic districts. James leaned forward. How deep does it go? City manager's office. Half the planning commission. 3 council members. She met his eyes. Your sergeant's just the tip. His phone buzzed. Chun, they're watching your place. Be careful. They're watching all of us, Sarah said. But we're watching back. She opened her laptop, showing surveillance photos. Carson meeting officials. Money changing hands. Peterson accepting envelopes. Your father's not the only one who kept records, she said. Other families reached out. Other officers, too. Others? Sarah nodded. You're not the first cop to ask questions. Just the first to get this far. A knock on the door. Chin entered, still in uniform. Martinez is with my dad, she said. Kid's got a conscience. And Peterson? Meeting with Carson right now. City Hall. She dropped a USB drive on the desk. Dashcam footage. Last 6 months of routine patrols on Maple Street. James picked up the drive. They logged everything. Had to. Department policy. Chun smiled grimly. Funny how rules work both ways. Sarah's phone rang. Walter's number. Dad? You okay? They all heard his voice, calm despite everything. They're here again. Carson himself this time. Says he has papers. What kind of papers? Emergency condemnation order. Says the house is structurally unsound. Walter's laugh held no humor. Giving me 24 hours to vacate. James was already moving. Stay there. Don't sign anything. James. Walter's voice stopped him. No. Stay with Sarah. Finish this right. But Dash, I taught civics for 30 years. Trust the system. Trust the process. A pause. Just make it count. The line went dead. Sarah was already dialing. Judge Matthews? Sarah Thompson. Remember that injunction we discussed? We need it now. Chin checked her phone. 3 units headed to Maple Street. Official call. Public safety inspection. How many officers still on our side? James asked. More than Peterson knows. She typed rapidly. Martinez is spreading the word. Quietly, Sarah hung up. Judge Matthews is signing the injunction. But what? It'll take an hour to process. To serve. She looked at James. They know that. His phone buzzed again. Carson. Final courtesy notice. Property will be secured at 9 a.m. Resistance will be noted. James checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. Show me everything, he said to Sarah. Every document, every photo, every connection. They spread it all out. A web of corruption mapped in paper and pixels. Money trails, shell companies, forged inspection reports. There, Chun pointed to a document. Demolition permits. Already approved. Dated tomorrow. They're not even pretending anymore, Sarah said quietly. James studied the permits. The signatures. The dates. They never were. This was always the plan. His phone lit up. Walter again. They're blocking the street. Both ends. In the background, they heard engines. Heavy equipment. Sarah grabbed her keys. I'm going. We all are. James gathered the documents. Chun. She touched her badge. Some things matter more than a job. They took separate cars, different routes. James spotted the black SUVs immediately. 4 of them, parked at strategic corners. Maple Street had become a war zone. Construction equipment idled at both ends. Men in suits mixed with workers in hard hats. Walter stood on his porch, Walker planted firmly, Martinez beside him in uniform. Carson saw them arrive. Ah, the cavalry. He held up a stack of papers. Too late, I'm afraid. Official city business. For public safety. Funny, Sarah stepped forward, her own papers raised. I have something official too. A nuisance lawsuit? Please. Carson smirked. I have 11 attorneys on retainer. No lawsuit. She handed him a blue-backed document. Federal injunction. Plus a warrant for your records. She smiled. The FBI has 12 attorneys. Already here? As if on cue, unmarked vehicles rolled in from every side street. Men and women in windbreakers marked FBI emerged. Carson's smirk faltered. Peterson Dash is already in custody. Chun nodded toward the station. along with some very interesting records. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency. Computers seized, phones confiscated, Carson and his men stripped of their papers. Walter remained on his porch, watching it all. James climbed the steps to join him. "You okay?" "Better than okay." Walter nodded towards Sarah, directing FBI agents. "She gets that from her mother. The steel inside. You taught her well." "No." Walter smiled. "Martha and I just showed her what mattered. She figured out the rest." He looked at James. "Like someone else I know?" Martinez cleared his throat. "Sir? They need your statement." Walter gripped his walker. "Help an old man down these steps?" James took his arm. Together, they descended into the morning light. Past the frustrated developers. Past the dismantled scheme. Past the place where doing right mattered more than doing well. Sarah met them at the bottom. "Dad, you're going to love this part. They want your documentation." "All of it?" Walter laughed. Martha's filing system finally pays off. The sun hit the stained glass windows, sending colored light across the yard. Somewhere, James thought, Martha Thompson was smiling. Sometimes the system worked if you worked it right. Sometimes standing your ground meant more than holding your piece of earth. Sometimes it meant holding on to what made that earth worth fighting for in the first place. The federal courthouse downtown hummed with anticipation. James sat in the witness box, facing a packed gallery. Carson and his lawyers filled one side, their expensive suits a uniform of privilege. On the other, Walter Thompson sat with Sarah, his walker propped beside the bench. "Officer Miller," the federal prosecutor began, "please describe your first encounter with representatives of Platinum Development Corporation." James leaned toward the microphone. "October 12th, two men in suits visited my home, Robert Carson and Michael Wells. They offered me $20,000 per successful transition of elderly property owners." Transition to what? Selling their homes. Specifically, homes that blocked Platinum's development plans. Carson whispered to his lawyer, who stood. "Objection. Speculation. Overruled." Judge Matthews hadn't smiled once. "Continue, Officer Miller." "Former officer," James corrected. "I resigned during the investigation." "Tell us why." James looked at Walter, then back to the prosecutor. "Because I couldn't wear the badge and ignore what was happening. The fraudulent violations, the harassment, the corruption. Objection. Overruled." "The witness will continue." James described everything, the fake inspection reports, the surveillance, the threats. With each detail, Carson's face grew darker. "And these documents?" The prosecutor held up a thick file. "Where did they come from?" "Multiple sources." Walter Thompson kept detailed records. Other officers provided evidence. Community members came forward. Why didn't they come forward sooner? "Fear." James looked directly at Carson. They were afraid of losing their homes, their pensions, their jobs. The prosecutor played the dash cam footage. Peterson's voice filled the courtroom. "Keep the pressure on. Carson wants that street clear by month's end." More evidence followed. Bank records, zoning changes, emails connecting Carson to officials in 3 states. During a recess, Walter approached James outside the courtroom. "You're doing well," the old teacher said. "Clear, direct answers. Just like I taught you." James smiled. "Finally earning that B-, maybe even a B+. Walter glanced at Carson's legal team, huddled in conference. "They're worried. You can see it in their posture." Sarah joined them, legal pad in hand. FBI found more. Other cities, same pattern. "They're calling it a RICO case now." "RICO?" James asked. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Walter's eyes twinkled. Civics class, Chapter 12. A bailiff called them back in. As they took their seats, James noticed Chun and Martinez in the gallery, watching intently. The defense began their cross-examination. "Mr. Miller," Carson's lawyer emphasized the Mr. "Isn't it true you were facing disciplinary action before resigning?" "Yes." "For investigating corruption, for insubordination, for harassment of legitimate businessmen, for objection." The prosecutor stood. Argumentative, sustained. The lawyers shifted tactics. "You visited Mr. Thompson's house repeatedly, after being ordered not to." "Yes." "Why?" James met the lawyer's eyes. Because some orders are wrong. Because protecting people matters more than protecting profits. Very noble. And now you're unemployed. Was it worth it? Ask Mr. Thompson. Ask his neighbors. Ask everyone who gets to keep their homes. The questioning continued for hours. They attacked his credibility, his motives, his judgment. Through it all, James kept his answers simple. Direct. True. During another break, Chin brought coffee. Martinez is testifying tomorrow, she said. Half the department's been subpoenaed. Peterson? Talking. A lot. She smiled. Amazing what people remember when facing federal charges. Walter sat heavily in a nearby chair. Almost over. Just need to finish strong. James noticed his fatigue. You okay, Mr. Thompson? Just tired. But good tired. He patted his walker. Like after a long lesson, when you know the students finally understood, the bailiff called them back again. Final arguments would begin. Carson's lawyer painted a picture of progress blocked by sentimentality, of necessary change resisted by emotional attachments, of a disgruntled ex-officer seeking revenge. The prosecutor told a different story, of homes and history stolen through fraud, of power abused and trust betrayed, of one man who chose right over easy. As the jury left to deliberate, Walter touched James's arm. Whatever happens, he said softly, you taught them too. Taught them what? That some things matter more than money. That some fights are worth losing everything for. He smiled. That sometimes the best lessons come from standing your ground. The jury was out for 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood straight. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Carson didn't move. On the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. His lawyer started writing appeals notes. On all remaining counts, we find the defendant guilty. Walter reached for his walker, but Sarah stopped him. Wait, Dad. There's more. Judge Matthews spoke. In addition to criminal penalties, this court orders full restitution to all affected property owners. All fraudulent violations are hereby vacated. All properties illegally obtained will be returned to their rightful owners. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. James tried to slip away, but Walter called him back. Stand with us, the old teacher said. You earned this too. Sarah faced the cameras, explaining the verdict's impact. Chun and Martinez stood nearby, badges gleaming in the sun. James felt Walter's hand on his shoulder. So, the old man said quietly, about that B-. Yes. Consider it upgraded. With honors. They watched Carson being led to a federal vehicle, his empire crumbling like autumn leaves. Sometimes justice came slowly, but it came. Sometimes the price of doing right was high, but worth paying. And sometimes, the best lessons weren't found in textbooks at all. The Platteville Gazette's headline screamed across James's kitchen table. Developer, Scandal Rock City. Federal investigation expands. Below it, smaller headlines detailed the fallout. Police sergeant pleads guilty. City officials resign. Historic homes saved. His phone rang. Chin's number. You watching the news? She asked. Just reading it. Turn on Channel 4. Live from City Hall. James flipped on his small TV. The mayor stood at a podium, looking uncomfortable. In light of recent events, I am announcing a complete review of all property transactions involving Platinum Development Corporation. Additionally, I have accepted the resignations of several key officials. The camera panned across the crowd, showing Walter in his usual spot, Walker at his side. Sarah stood next to him, taking notes. They're not stopping with Carson, Chin said. FBI's following every lead. Every connection. How many so far? 12 arrests since yesterday. More coming. She paused. Internal Affairs wants to talk to you. James watched the mayor squirm under reporters' questions. About what? Your job. Your badge. Another pause. They're cleaning house, James. Department needs good cops more than ever. A knock at his door interrupted his response. Through the window, he saw Martinez on his porch in uniform. I'll call you back, he told Chen. Martinez looked nervous. Got a minute? James let him in. The young officer stood awkwardly, holding a folder. Internal Affairs sent me. They want you to see this before it goes public. Inside the folder, James found his service record. and beneath it, a letter of reinstatement. They're offering back pay, Martinez said. Full rank restoration. Plus. Plus what? Sergeant's exam. Fast-tracked. Martinez shifted his weight. Peterson's spot needs filling. James set the folder down. Why send you? Because I asked. Martinez straightened. You showed us what being a real cop means. Standing up. Doing right. He gestured at the folder. Department needs that. Now more than ever. On TV, the press conference continued. A reporter asked about compensation for affected homeowners. Full restitution, the mayor promised. Every fraudulent fine refunded. Every forced sale reversed. The camera found Walter again. He wasn't smiling, just watching. Teaching, even now. James's phone buzzed. Text from Sarah. Dad wants to know if you're coming to the neighborhood meeting tonight. Meeting? Martinez nodded. Maple Street Preservation Society. They're organizing to protect other historic areas. He grinned. Mr. Thompson's idea. Says civic engagement starts at home. James looked at the reinstatement letter. At his badge. Still shiny despite everything. Tell Internal Affairs I'll think about it. They want an answer by dash, they'll get it. After tonight's meeting, Martinez understood. I'll tell them. At the Maple Street Community Center that evening, James found the parking lot full. Inside, familiar faces filled every chair. Walter sat up front, Sarah beside him. Chun and her mother. The Hendersons back from their forced retirement. Mrs. Williams, her bakery keys returned. Quite a turnout, Walter said as James sat down. You're doing? Community's doing. People want to protect what matters. He tapped his walker. Just needed reminding why it matters. Sarah stood, calling the meeting to order. She outlined the legal victories, the ongoing investigations, the plans for preservation. But most importantly, she said, we need to stay vigilant. What happened here could happen anywhere. Hands raised. Questions asked. People who'd been scared now spoke freely. Mrs. Chun described the pressure to sell her bakery. Mr. Henderson detailed the false health code violations. Each story connected to others. Each victory inspired more. During a break, Walter pulled James aside. Internal Affairs came by the house, he said. About the case? About you? Walter's eyes twinkled. Wanted character references. Teacher's perspective. What did you tell them? That some lessons take time to sink in. But when they do, he gestured at the crowded room. Look what happens. James watched the community he'd protected come together. Stronger now. Wiser. They offer me Peterson's spot, he said quietly. I know. Walter smiled. What are you going to do about it? What would you do? Teach. The old man's voice was firm. From the inside this time. Show them what service really means. Chun joined them, coffee cups in hand. Station's different now, she said. Officers asking questions. Checking records. Making sure. Like they should have before, James noted. Like they will now. She handed him a cup. If the right people lead them. His phone buzzed. Internal Affairs. Decision? Walter watched him read the message. You know, the old teacher said, I gave you the B- for a reason. Because I was struggling? Because you were learning? Walter stood slowly. Still are. Still teaching, too. The meeting resumed. Sarah called for volunteers, community patrols, legal observers, preservation committees. Hands raised. Names listed. People stepping up. James looked at his phone. At his community. At the change one stand could create. He typed his response. I accept. Because sometimes the best way to protect what matters is from within. Sometimes the hardest lessons teach the most important truths. And sometimes A B- is just the beginning of the real education. 3 months later, Sergeant James Miller walked his old beat through Central Park. The autumn leaves had given way to winter frost, but the paths remained the same. His phone buzzed. A text from Martinez. First community oversight meeting tonight. Full attendance. James smiled, remembering the changes. After Carson's conviction, the department had transformed. New policies. New training. New focus on community trust. His radio crackled. Not with warnings about civilian contact, but with updates on neighborhood watch meetings and community events. Near the chess tables, he spotted a familiar figure with a walker. Mr. Thompson, he called out. Bit cold for your usual walk. Walter looked up, smiling. Sergeant Thompson now, is it? Still getting used to that. Makes two of us. James fell in a step beside him. How's the Preservation Society? Growing. 3 more neighborhoods joined last week. Walter's walker left slight marks in the frost. Sarah's helping them set up legal committees, teaching them what to watch for. They reached the old fountain, now wrapped for winter. A plaque had been added, dedicated to those who stood their ground. Your idea? James asked. Martha's. Sarah found it in her papers. Plans for a community garden, meeting spaces. Walter gestured toward the park's edge. A place where people could come together. Remember what matters. James noticed the changes already starting. New benches. Improved paths. Real improvements, not developer schemes. Station's different too, he said. Officers getting involved. Knowing their beats. Their neighbors. Like it should be. Walter stopped looking at him. Speaking of which, got something to show you. From his coat, he pulled a folded paper. James recognized his old test from civics class. Been meaning to update this, Walter said, handing it over. James opened it. The B- had been carefully crossed out. In its place, A+. Little late for grade changes, isn't it? Never too late to recognize growth. Walter smiled. Or to keep learning. They continued walking, passing the spot where they'd first talked months ago. No suited men watched now. No black SUVs lurked. James's phone buzzed again. Chun, Mrs. Williams reopening the bakery. Whole department invited. Community's healing, Walter noted, seeing the message. Stronger than before. Because of you. Because of us. All of us. Walter tapped his walker. Takes more than one stand to make change last. They reached Maple Street. The Victorian houses stood proud, their holiday decorations twinkling in the early dusk. Sarah's moving back, Walter said suddenly. To Platteville? Opening a law practice. Community advocacy. He chuckled. Says someone needs to keep an eye on me. In the city. She's good at both. Gets it from her mother. Walter looked at his house. Martha's roses dormant, but protected for spring. You know, she asked about you. Sarah? Said the Preservation Society needs legal advisors. People who understand both sides. Walter's eyes twinkled. Could be interesting. James thought about his new role. The changes he could make. The lessons he could share. His radio came alive. Sergeant Miller, community meetings starting in 20. Duty calls, he said. Always does. Walter started up his walk. But now it's the right kind of duty. At the station, James found his new office. Peterson's old space transformed. Gone were the citations and violation notices. In their place, community outreach plans, neighborhood watch schedules, training programs for cultural awareness and elderly support. Martinez knocked on his door. Ready for the meeting, Sarge? Almost. James picked up Walter's test, now framed on his wall. Just remembering some lessons. The community room filled quickly. Chun and her mother. The Hendersons. Mrs. Williams with fresh cookies. Walter and Sarah sharing a legal pad. James stood to address them, feeling the weight of his sergeant's stripes. The responsibility of trust earned. 3 months ago, he began, this community taught us all something important. Faces looked back, not with fear now, but with confidence. Partnership. They taught us that a neighborhood is more than buildings. That progress doesn't mean destroying history. That standing together matters more than standing aside. Walter nodded slightly, still teaching, still watching his student become the teacher. So today we're not just talking about policing. We're talking about community, about trust, about doing what's right, not what's easy. Sarah passed out papers, new initiatives, protection plans, ways to preserve what mattered while welcoming real progress. Because that's what community means, James concluded. Not just living together, but standing together, growing together, making things right together. The meeting continued, ideas shared, plans made, bridges built. Afterward, Walter lingered. Not bad, he said. For a B- student. Had a good teacher, had a good heart. Walter headed for the door. That's what really matters. Outside, snow began falling softly. James walked Walter home, their footprints marking the path they defended. The Victorian stained glass caught the last light, sending colors across the fresh snow. like Martha's roses blooming in winter. Sometimes the best lessons come full circle. Sometimes standing your ground means finding new ways to move forward. And sometimes the greatest victories aren't in what you save, but in what you build together after the saving's done.